On Halloween night in 1993, 35-year-old William Bill Dudley got into a fight with his girlfriend in rural Clear Brook, Virginia. Two men who were friends of the couple intervened, and according to everyone who was there that night, all three men then got into another fight. After the altercation, Bill was reportedly seen by everyone there walking back to his trailer on that property, but that was the last time that he was ever seen. And now, 33 years later, his family is still looking for answers. Hi everybody, and welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, let's tell everybody what we're getting into today.
So today's a really interesting story and a really interesting case. We were actually contacted by this family through social media, which is one of our favorite things, is when people actually see this channel and say, hey, this would be helpful for our situation, and they reach out to us. Let's start where we always do, and let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet William Bill Dudley and talk about who he was, and then we will go through the circumstances surrounding his disappearance.
William Dudley lived most of his life in Virginia. I think that for a short period of time, he actually lived in South Carolina, but he was born in Alexandria, and his family moved to Woodbridge when he was a little bit older. And as we know, when he disappeared, he was living in Virginia. Most of this guy's life, he did live in Virginia. He was born in 1958. So when he went missing in 93, he was 35 years old. If Bill's alive today out there somewhere, he's 68 years old today. As Sean said, he was a very big guy. This was a man who was 6'2". He was anywhere between 200, 215 pounds. Bill had a pretty normal life. He married in 1979. He had 3 children with his wife. We've actually spoken to several of the children from that marriage. They did separate in 1985, and after his separation from his wife, Bill began dating a woman named Cindy Benner. Now, Cindy and Bill had a very long relationship, and they actually had a daughter together. They lived on a property where Cindy's grandmother actually owned the property, and there was one home on that property. And then there were several trailers that were sort of scattered around the property. Bill was living in one of those trailers at the time of his disappearance. Cindy was actually, according to what we've heard and what we've been able to find out from our interviews with people, Cindy was actually living in the main house with her grandmother and with the daughter that she had with Bill. And Bill was living in a separate house. And then there were some other folks who were also living on the property in other trailer residences, which we'll get into. Because it does tie into the story. So from everyone that we've spoken to and from our own research, what we've been able to find out is that Bill and Cindy had a pretty volatile relationship, and that sometimes that could get physical. So they were known to fight. Everybody that knew Bill, everybody that we've been able to talk to, basically said that Bill was a good worker and that he was actually a very kind person and that he was, he cared for his daughters and he was a kind man. But, and this is a big but, everyone has also told us that he did have a drinking problem and that the good Bill was there when he was sober. But in the 90s, when he did have this alcohol problem, the bad Bill could come out when he was drinking. So, I think this isn't to make a judgment against Bill, who may or may not still be with us. This is just to sort of lay out the facts, because I think the drinking is going to come into play in this next part of the story. And the possible DV situation that may have existed between Bill and Cindy may also play a role in what happens next. So like I said, in 1993, Bill was living on a property that was owned by Cindy's grandmother. Now, the setup is a bit unorthodox, so let's just kind of lay it out for you. So basically, there was this property, there was a main house, and inside that main house was Cindy's grandmother, Cindy, and the child that Bill and Cindy had together. Now, there were also several trailers located on that property. In one of those trailers, that's where Bill was living. And in another trailer, it was occupied by 2 guys. Now, one of them was named Roger Benner, and he was a relative of Cindy's. And Roger's friend was living with him, and his name was Glenn Kearns. Now, those 2 names are going to matter a lot as we get further into the story. So it's Roger Benner, who was Cindy's relative, and Glenn Kearns. And they're living in one trailer. Bill's living in another trailer. Cindy's living with her grandmother and her and Bill's child in a house that's also on the property. Now, according to Bill's daughters, Bill was actually friendly with Roger and Glenn. They hung out. They would drink together, and everyone was kind of like on good terms. Within this property. Call it what you will. I mean, to me, it almost sounds like a compound with like multiple dwellings on it, and people kind of coming and going as they please, and kind of hanging out when they want to, right? But as I said, according to everyone that we've talked to from the family, Bill was cool with these guys, and that they were also cool with the kids. The kids do remember these guys. That Bill's children from his first marriage would come around. They'd spend time on this property. They'd spend time with Bill. They spent time with Cindy. They were close with the child that Bill and Cindy had together, and they were also friendly with Roger and Glenn, who were these two guys who also lived on the property. So these are the people that are sort of the main players in this story, and these are the people that were there the night that Bill disappeared on October 31st, 1993.
So let's talk about that Halloween night. Bill spends the first part of that night with the two friends of his who are, friends, and one of them a relative of Cindy's who live on the property, Roger and Glenn. Now, by all accounts, these guys spent the night basically just having some beers, talking, hanging out. Nothing strange or unusual happened at all. At some point, Roger and Glenn decide to leave. They go back to their trailer on the property, and this is around 9:30. Bill is by himself. Keep in mind what we know about this and what comes next all really comes from Roger, Glenn, and Cindy and her mother, who are up at the main residence, at the main house on this property. So according to them, this is what happens next. After Bill drinks by himself for a while, he calls Cindy from his trailer at the main house and asks to come up and see her. Now, Miles already said these two were known to have a little bit of a volatile relationship. They'd been together for about 7 years at this point, and according to Cindy, she felt like this was probably going to be a bad time for Bill to come up there because he'd been drinking, and it seemed like there was some sort of tension between them that night already, and she sensed that this would lead to a fight, right? She didn't want him to come up there because she thought if he comes up here, we're just going to get into it. He's drinking, it's just going to get ugly. So she asked him not to come. Whether or not that's true, again, this is coming from Cindy, right? Bill's not here to tell his side of these events, but that's what we've heard. So according to Cindy, Bill ignores that request. He comes to the house anyway. She lets him in, and they get to talking. And of course, as she predicted, this does get ugly. And soon it turns into an argument, and then even worse. And Cindy alleges that Bill punches her in the nose. Later, she will tell investigators that she thinks that he broke her nose. Although we'll hear from the family more about whether or not that's true, but that's the official story, right? He came in here, we had an argument, and he punched me in the nose. So like Miles said, Cindy is a fighter as well. And so they start getting into it. And soon there's a very loud commotion in this house. And the two guys that Bill had been drinking with earlier, Roger and Glenn, can hear it from their trailer on the property. They come running into the house. They come inside, and soon all three men spill out into the front of the home, and they're fighting. That's the thing about all of these guys. These are blue-collar dudes. They're in their 30s. They're all drinkers. And all of them seemed like they were very comfortable, brawling, basically. So these guys are in the front yard, and they are brawling, right? All three of these guys are scrappers, according to Bill's daughters. He especially was the kind of guy that never backed down from a fight, and he certainly wasn't going to back down from this one. But unfortunately, it gets so carried away that one of the men, Glenn, winds up finding a baseball bat somewhere nearby, and he actually hits Bill in the back of the head and the back of the shoulders with it. So once the bat comes out and it gets that serious, Bill decides to stop fighting, right? Obviously, it's one thing to fight two guys in a fist fight, but when you're getting hit in the head with a bat and there's two people, probably time to try to break that fight up. And that's what happens. So everything kind of calms down at that point. The guys go back to their trailer, Roger and Glenn, and Bill is left there, presumably with a pretty bad headache, with Cindy, who also apparently has like a bloody nose. And what happens next is he's apologizing. She says that he tries to wipe some blood off of her face, and they kind of make nice, right? Like things got really carried away there. Everybody's drunk, but the violence is over, and everyone's going to kind of go their separate ways. So with Roger and Glenn in their trailer, and Bill and Cindy talking, Cindy's mother arrives. Now, Cindy's mother does not like Bill, and you might imagine you could see possibly why, right? This is the kind of thing that's happening on her property. Once in a while, you could see that the relationship's probably not great. And at this point, Bill decides, okay, well, if the mom's here, maybe it's best if I just go back to my trailer. And he walks into the night back towards his trailer. Cindy and her mother go back in the main house. And that is the last time Bill is ever seen.
Now, according to the family, and this is also from the folks that we've been speaking to on Bill's side, and who are still around and who are looking for him and hoping to find out what happened to him, Bill was known to take off and sort of like go off on his own when Cindy and him would have a fight. So the idea that Bill was just kind of like disappear, he had been known to do that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. He had been known to take time to himself, leave, and just go off and do whatever Bill wanted to do. So initially, nobody seeing Bill for a couple of days doesn't sort of raise any alarms with the folks that are living on the property. Again, I think it's important for me to reiterate that everything that we know that we're laying out here, that comes from the fight to the couple of days afterwards and the response to it, comes directly from Cindy, her grandmother, Cindy's mom, and Roger and Glenn. The people that were there that night. Obviously, the mother came in later, but the people that were there during the fight and the mom who came in later. They're the only people who have any accounting of what had happened and what happened in the next couple of days afterwards. So basically, Bill's goes back to his trailer the night of the 31st, and that's the last time anybody sees him. For a couple of days, according to their accounts, nobody on the property really takes any notice of it because Bill had been known to take off. Bill had been known to get into a fight with Cindy and then go off on his own. And I don't mean go back to his trailer. I mean just disappear, go off on a trip, go wandering, whatever. He would go off and do his thing, and then he'd come back. So nobody's alarms were really going off because I guess this was sort of accepted behavior, according to them, by Bill. So several days after, 3-4 days had passed at this point, Cindy goes, she never told exactly how many days, but Cindy goes back to Bill's trailer to see if he is there. And that's when she finds his wallet, his keys, and all of his other personal belongings sitting on his table. But Bill is gone. So obviously, that's a little bit strange because if he had gone wandering off to do his own thing in a planned way, most likely he would have taken his personal belongings with him. He would have taken his wallet, his ID, whatever cash he had on hand, his keys. But that stuff was all kind of sitting on the table where it would have been if he was kind of like hanging out at the trailer or just hanging out on the property as he was the night of the 31st, right? So to me, and Sean, I don't know how you feel about it, but to me, this is one of the strongest sort of indicators that this was not a planned disappearance, that Bill didn't go off on his own, in some quest to clear his mind after a volatile fight with his girlfriend, Cindy. So at this point, when Cindy goes into Bill's trailer, she sees his stuff is there. She is a bit alarmed at that point. So she does contact Bill's mother and tells her that Bill is missing. Now, according to all accounts, Bill's mom isn't really worried at this point. She understands that he does do this. She understands that he's been doing this a long time, apparently even before he was with Cindy, where when Bill would get upset, his thing was to sort of like go off and, do his thing. The only difference here is that he usually would contact his mom, and this time he didn't because he was very close with his mother. And we've heard this from both our own research and from speaking with Bill's daughters, that he was in contact with his mom. And most times when he would get into a fight with Cindy, when he would, go off on his own to try to clear his head, he would call her, and he didn't this time. So the mom, for some reason, and this is something that I have a lot of trouble understanding in this case, because Cindy did go to his mom and she did tell her that Bill had gone missing. The mom waits 2 weeks before she becomes seriously concerned. And at that point, Bill's mom starts doing her own search. So her and her immediate relatives go and they visit bars along U.S. Route 11. They travel from the Virginia state line towards West Virginia. They go out and they give out missing persons posters. And basically, they're just doing like a sort of on the ground grassroots search and outreach to see if they can find anyone who had seen Bill. But they don't get any confirmed sightings, and they still haven't gotten any phone calls. So there's no contact from Bill, and nobody has seen him. So there's absolutely no indication that Bill had gone on this route and that he had, gone off to, like, clear his head and stop somewhere or anything like that. They can't find anything. So a month after the disappearance, in early December, Bill's mom finally goes to the police and reports him missing. Now, why does it take so long? I'm not sure. And unfortunately, the people that we've been able to talk to directly in the interviews that you guys will see on this channel in the coming weeks, these guys were very young at this point. So they don't have all the answers about this, right? Because they were just kids. But for some reason, Bill's mom waits more than a month to go to the authorities to formally report him missing. And I think, at that point, we have to take that delay into account, and we have to understand that it really matters, because by the time the investigators have become involved, weeks and weeks have passed. The property has not been preserved. If the property was a crime scene, if something did happen to Bill that, somebody didn't want to find out, that could have obviously been covered up at this point. Any physical evidence that would have been present on that property could have been well taken care of by the time the cops come around. Also, if something happened and there was some sort of cover up, taking place, all of the people involved, all of the potential witnesses would have had a lot of time to kind of come together and come up with an alibi and come up with a story that they could all, believe in. As you guys know, everybody watching this channel, is a sort of a follower of true crime and a follower of these stories. So that the whole thing is, when something happens like this, you get all the witnesses and you put them in separate rooms and you start interviewing them and you try to find holes and you try to see if their stories add up. But when you give somebody weeks and weeks and weeks to sit on something, and if they have done something, but you're basically giving them time to craft a story, you're giving them time to cover up the physical evidence, you're giving them time to secure things so that they have a better chance of getting away with it. So whatever happened on that Halloween night, on October 31st, 1993, by the time the cops get involved, it's already a cold case at that point.
Yeah, you make a great point. And one thing I'll add to it too is that, even if there's not a criminal scene here, and this is actually just as mysterious to everybody there as it is to the investigators, I mean, their recollection of that night would be critical, right? And interviewing them the next day or 48 hours later would be super different than interviewing them 4 weeks later about a drunken night that they had a month ago, right? And what happened and what was the last thing you remember and the last thing you saw. Some people would have perfect recall. A lot of people wouldn't. And so even if there's nothing nefarious going on, that's a huge problem in this investigation. And we've seen this on other cases we've covered on this channel, where sometimes the person who's missing has a history of either, some sort of substance abuse or some sort of mental thing or whatever it is, but they have a history of disappearing for weeks at a time and then coming back. And when you do that to your family enough, eventually they get used to it, and you disappear, and they don't immediately do what most people would do, which is call the cops after a day. They give you 2 days or a week or sometimes even a month. And then finally they're like, all right, this is unusual. And unfortunately in that case, which is Bill's case, it really sets back any investigation that can take place because of everything that Miles just said. So with that being said, in December, when this finally does get brought to the authorities' attention, they come in and they do the best that they can with the information available to them, right? And obviously that's going to be looking at the property where Bill was last seen and where this confrontation took place and speaking to everybody there. That means Cindy, her mom, Roger, and Glenn. Now, what they tell police is basically what we just told you. That's the official version of the story. Like I said, it all comes from them. They're the only people around to tell it. So we don't know for sure that everything played out beat by beat the way that they said it did. We have to sort of take them on faith, right? The only person who could possibly challenge it or really corroborate it would be Bill himself. And unfortunately, he's not around to tell us if they're being completely truthful or if there's more to the story. One interesting thing is that there was a lot of forthcomingness, it seems like, up to a certain point at least, and that Glenn freely admitted to the police that he did hit Bill in the head with a bat, which, you would think if they had conspired, they could have left that element out and the police never would have known about it. I mean, again, Bill's not here to tell us. So it is kind of interesting to note that they decided to include, or at least Glenn decided to include, that detail, which only makes Glenn look bad. Nevertheless, the police did take the bat. They held on to it. And interestingly, they still weren't really considering this a homicide investigation. They were still looking at it as possibly a voluntary disappearance. At least that's what Bill's family told us was told to them by the investigators all those years ago, is that they were kind of like hesitant to go down the road of these people did something to him, and really wanted to go first down the road of where did Bill go on his own? Let's rule that out first. And if we can rule that out, then maybe we'll start looking at this as more of a foul play situation. And maybe, again, maybe it's because there was the forthcomingness about the bat and everything that you would think, okay, well, these guys are volunteering these details that maybe they shouldn't be volunteering if they're concerned for not being looked at for this situation. But it's hard to imagine what they might have been thinking all these years later. It's just interesting. So Roger and Glenn also told the police that they left, after the confrontation, and that they had never seen Bill again after that. Because obviously the police asked them, did you guys go back and talk to him again? Was there a second fight, right? Like after the girls went inside, did you guys all come out of your trailers and try to hatch it out and it got violent again? And they said no, adamantly, we never saw him. We went to our trailer and that was it. We heard them talking and then eventually not. And that's all that we know. And what's interesting is that their accounts really do line up with Cindy's account, right? Which is that Bill calmed down, backed down from the fight once the bat came out. And everything that that everybody says lines up with each other, right? All of their stories line up. There's no weird thing where one person says something that the others have a different take on. So you have to kind of look at that and wonder, okay, well, there's a couple reasons for this potentially. Either they're all telling the truth, which is what that would normally look like, or, it's been a month. Maybe they've all decided to get one story and get it straight. And then the investigators are contacted. And by the time they actually get to questioning, everybody's had time to get on the same page. And I'm not saying that's what happened, but it's conceivable, right? So again, a problem with coming to this investigation a month late is that it gives things like that time to potentially happen. Or at least the idea that they could have is now introduced into the case, which raises doubts about all of this stuff. So speaking of doubt, one interesting fact is that Roger and Glenn were offered polygraph tests over the years, and they have both declined to take them. Now, it's really important to remember, right? These things are not foolproof. There's a reason that they're not admissible in court, and the declining to take a polygraph test does not indicate guilt. But it's part of the story, right? So we would be kind of remiss if we didn't bring up the fact that as the events of that night have been called into question over the years, that machine has been introduced as a possible, hey, you want to hook this thing up and tell that story again? And those guys have both declined it. Make of that what you will. Maybe they have great reasons for it. Maybe they don't. Either way, we wanted to let you guys know. As the years have gone on in this investigation, the voluntary, disappearance angle has not really held a lot of water. Like Miles said, all of Bill's belongings were left behind. It's pretty difficult to imagine that a guy who really had no reason to leave would get hit in the head with a bat in the middle of the night while drunk, and then go off voluntarily, leaving behind his vehicle, his wallet, his children, his ex-wife, his current girlfriend, and his child with her, and somehow have the wherewithal, the resources, and the ability to start a new life voluntarily. So with that being said, I mean, it does seem like the police position on this case has evolved since day one, right, Miles, when they were really looking at it as maybe more of a voluntary disappearance?
It has moved from the idea that believing what the police were told that night, that it was a voluntary disappearance, to thinking that there was actual foul play involved in Bill's going missing, and that he probably met with his end, and it's probably a homicide. So there is a very interesting detail that comes up later, which is that Crystal, one of Bill's daughters, who you guys will meet because we conducted an interview with her, goes and asks Cindy about getting her father's belongings. Now, remember, Crystal and Bill's other daughters from his first marriage, they had a relationship with Cindy. They had known her for years. They were close with their sister, who was Cindy's daughter. They're kind of like their half sibling, right? So, these were folks who knew each other well, and they considered each other family to some extent. And so they went and they asked for their father's belongings, as a memory. And according to what Crystal has told us, Cindy said that Bill's belongings had been destroyed in a fire that had sort of engulfed his trailer, and that nothing remained. Now, we don't have documentation on this. Nothing was reported. There's no official record of a fire on that property or anything like that. But, the interesting thing is that, if it's true, how did that fire start? Why did that fire start? And, why were Bill's possessions still in that trailer and were, completely destroyed by that fire? I don't know if we'll ever get answers to that, but I do think it's worth, it's something to chew on, right? So, which brings us to the big question, right? It's the central mystery of this story, which is what happened to Bill after that fight?
Well, there's a couple of theories, right? I think that they sort of make themselves obvious, but we'll cover them anyway. I mean, the big one is, did that bat strike to Bill's head wind up killing him? I mean, you hear about this kind of thing pretty frequently. Somebody gets hit in the head. They don't realize how badly they're actually injured, and it can be hours or days later that they actually die from internal bleeding, brain hemorrhage, all kinds of damage that can be done that might not make itself apparent at first. And if that's the case, was it covered up, right? Is this a situation where this fight maybe started and nobody was intended to die that night, but somebody did die? And from there, the people responsible, rather than contact authorities and take responsibility, decided to conceal it, right? Well, when you start thinking about trailer fires that aren't reported to insurance companies and all these things, people moving away right after the fact, you could see why someone might look at the situation and say, I have to wonder about that, right? Of course, that's never been proven, and it's been looked at, and it's hard to prove that kind of a thing this many years later, but it certainly is one of those details that sticks out to everybody that looks at this. I mean, if Bill didn't die, where is he, right? If he wandered off and died on the property, why wasn't he found, right? If he just dropped dead and nobody knew about it, you would think that with all the police presence and the searches, somebody would have located that body. So if he did die, it sort of stands to believe that somebody might have then concealed him. That would answer that question.
Absolutely, Sean. I think the second major theory, the second major possibility in this case is that the fight happened as everybody said it did. Bill was seriously injured, and then he walked away and kind of died accidentally somewhere out in the woods. You have to remember, this is a very rural area that they're in. There's a lot of, sort of like wild land around. And it's quite possible that Bill could have just, been disoriented, done a walk, and ended up somewhere where, he didn't expect to be and expired out there, right? It's possible. Maybe he wandered into the woods. Maybe he fell into water. Maybe he was out there too late and he died from exposure to the elements. It's late October, right? Maybe there's an animal attack. I mean, anything's possible, right? So, this is a guy that, had just come from a confrontation where he, as Sean said, he may have suffered some sort of traumatic head injury. We don't know. We don't know exactly what the outcome of the admitted, hitting him with a bat, what that led to. But it is possible that Bill wandered off on his own and ended up, in a bad place, right? I think the problem with this is that no remains have ever been located, right? And look, I know a lot of you guys are going to say, hey, there's lots of cases that you guys have covered on True Crime Unsolved where people have wandered off into the woods and, their remains have never been found. But those cases also, we're not sure that that's what happened, right? I mean, Liam Toman comes to mind where, I still don't believe that he did wander off into the elements. And, that's why his remains have never been found as far as I'm concerned. So, look, there have been searches conducted and no sign of Bill has ever been found. The other thing is that investigators now clearly, and they have for a while, they're clearly leaning towards foul play. This is common knowledge. It's hard for me to buy into the fact that he just kind of wandered off, because how far could he have actually have gotten in that state if he was injured and he ended up somewhere out there? Most likely it would have come up in a search, I would think. But who knows? I think, Sean, there's probably one other option as far as theories go.
The other big one would be a voluntary disappearance, right? Which I think nobody is really considering at this point. I mean, you have to imagine a guy who has no real reason to leave his living situation, even though there's been a fight. I mean, he still has a child with this woman. He has two other children with his ex-wife, and he's very present in their lives. And he has a job. I mean, there's no reason for him to disappear. Plus, he's drunk. He's just been struck in the head with a bat, and his keys and his wallet are left behind. I mean, really, does this seem like the kind of person that's going to, pop up on a beach in Costa Rica 15 years later? Like, I did it. I planned it all. I don't think so. So I'm tempted to sort of write that one off. And it seems like the police have as well. The only other thing I can think of is that something completely different could have happened involving all these people. And it may have some shades of truth, right? There may have been a bat involved at one point. I'm sure there was a fight, but that the story that the police have heard is not the real story, and that something was done to Bill, and we just don't know what. Maybe there was actually a gun involved. Maybe the bat is just part of it. And that's sort of like the kernel of truth to a much bigger story that we haven't heard in its entirety, right? So I think that's almost where this investigation is going in a way. Not necessarily that there's more injurious stuff than the bad. The bad could really be it, but that there's more going on around that fight than we've learned. Because everywhere else you look, you're basically left with the option that Bill walked off on his own, whether later succumbing to the elements or dying, or living and for some reason disappearing and never coming back. And neither of those make a lot of sense. So we keep refocusing on the people that were there that night and asking, you've got to know more. There's got to be more to this, right? Then you look at the fact that some of them are reluctant to, be hooked up to polygraph machines, and you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, I guess it's a risky thing to do, even if you're innocent. I can understand that, because these things are not completely reliable. A very innocent person could say, I'm not going to do that either way. Okay. That happens, but still we're looking for patterns here. Right. And I think that the pattern that the law enforcement keeps going back to, and that the family keeps coming back to, is someone here's not saying the whole truth, right? More happened than we know about. And the fact that all of this evidence has been, burned or has gone missing, and everyone's moved away, it's uncomfortable when you look at it. It sure doesn't feel like Bill walked away voluntarily. And I know that, the other thing I'll say is, after speaking to his family and hearing how much they love their dad and how much their dad loved them, it's really hard to conceive that he would have done that just because he got into a physical fight one night. Now he's never going to see his kids again on his part. And that's his decision. It doesn't make any sense to me. And it doesn't make any sense to them. So I think something happened to Bill. Whether or not somebody's criminally responsible, I think that's yet to be determined. But certainly that's where this seems to be going, right? That's what this investigation has yet to determine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when I said there's one more option, I was talking about the second one that you laid out there, which is that they're not telling the whole truth and that something else happened that night, right? Because I don't even think that the voluntary disappearance is an option with this. I mean, sometimes you can at least contemplate it. I know I always do this. I always say it's next to impossible to disappear unless you have extreme means, right? Or, and look, some people do it, but you either have to have like incredible wherewithal to, be able to just throw everything away and completely go out there on your own and rebuild, or you have to have money. And the fact that Bill left his wallet, he didn't have anything. And he was a guy who, he was a dad. I mean, he was involved with his family. Like, yes, this was a man with problems. This was a man whose daughters themselves admit that he had an alcohol problem and had it for quite some time. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't dedicated to being a father. That doesn't mean that he wasn't dedicated to these relationships. Everybody has said when the guy was sober, when he wasn't drinking, he was a good father, he was a hard worker, and he was there for people. So, listen, I don't think that the voluntary disappearance is even a possibility. I think that what we're looking at is either, yes, he succumbed to the injury from the baseball bat, and the people who were involved with that fight freaked out and covered it up. He wandered off on his own after the injury and expired somewhere out in the wilderness. or something else happened that went far beyond the story that was told, and perhaps the baseball bat wasn't even true and it was just a cover-up, because, you know, that happens sometimes. Like, people do things and they're like, oh yeah, you know, and they give this like other version of it just to like admit a little bit of guilt. So, you know, look, who knows? We don't know. What we're hoping is that by bringing some light to this case after all these years, that maybe somebody out there does know. Maybe at least we can spread some awareness, and maybe the best case scenario is that somebody who's been told something, or somebody that actually knows something directly, will come out of the woodwork after all these years and actually speak. Because as you'll see next week, you're going to meet Bill's daughters. These are people who don't have any answers. These are people who haven't gotten any closure. They don't know if their father is alive or dead. If he's dead, they don't know where his remains are. They just want to know what happened, and they want to be able to tell their kids what happened to their grandfather. And, you know, I think that's ultimately what we're about here, is the victims' families, and, you know, trying to get answers and trying to bring closure for people. And look, if, you know, there's a little bit of justice in there too, great. But I think ultimately they just want to be able to say, hey, that's what happened to our dad. That's where he is now. And we can finally move on from that. And if we can help doing that by bringing some light to this case, that's what we want to do. So guys, please stay tuned. Next week, you're going to hear from Bill's daughters directly. And I think there's going to be some things that they're going to tell you that we didn't cover in this case breakdown. We felt that it was better to hear it directly from them and not to really make it part of this narrative, and let it be them to tell you directly. So please stay tuned for that, because there are going to be a couple of surprises in that story that we didn't lay out here. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. Please drop them below. I know that we didn't post last week. We've been sort of like, you know, restructuring some things here at the channel, and, you know, we've got some great cases coming up. We're back in the booking stage right now, and as you guys know, we don't just sit here and sort of regurgitate Wikipedia articles, as Sean always likes to say. Our bread and butter is doing these in-depth cases where we actually get access, and, you know, sometimes that takes some time. So we're working on building up a whole new slate of stories that we're going to go after, a whole new slate of cases that we're going after for you guys, and a whole lot of interviews that we're doing. So please drop us some comments. We're still going to do our comment reacts. And always, guys, if you like what we're doing, please give the video a like. Think about subscribing to the channel. And if you really, really like what you're doing, and if you really, really like what we're doing, please become a member. Help support what we're doing. As they say, buy us a cup of coffee. Help us keep the engine moving. And if you're watching this and you have any information about Bill's case, we're going to put up all the tip line information for the Frederick County Sheriff's Office. Please, please, please go there and tell them what you know.
Awesome. All right. So we will see you guys next week, where we will meet Bill's daughters. And as usual, we will see you all in the comments.